I think my earliest memory, and I showed you a photo, is I'm not quite 2 years old. And I do remember going then, but we used to go quite regularly. It used to be where we go for our Sunday drive and whatever. And the only thing my brothers and I could agree on tended to be the zoo. So the zoo used to be a popular one. So you'd come through the main entrance, that fantastic main entrance. And one of the things I'd look out for on the way, which I'm sad that's no longer in Mossman, is one of the buildings, and it was one of the corner buildings, used to have animals' heads on it, a bit like the zoo's entry point. And I always knew I was getting close, even before you could read signs and things, the age before you could read, you were near the zoo because you were near the little shopping centre that had all the animals on it. So then you get to the main entrance and it had all the animals on it. That was pretty exciting. And then you'd work your way back a little bit and see the otters and the koalas. And then you'd plunge down the hill to the giraffes, which was a must. You had to see the giraffes because they're so beautiful. And just nearby them were the horsies and llamas, which were the zebras, and big favourite because I'm a mad keen horse fan. And for some reason, I was obsessed by the giant anteaters. I think because they looked so peculiar. So I had to see them. And then we'd probably have lunch or something like that. And I think to give my parents a break from sort of rushing from enclosure to enclosure, we were usually given the choice of a train ride or a merry-go-round ride. And sometimes, but for a long time I was too little, an elephant ride. And being a merry-go-round nut, my choice was usually the merry-go-round. But I do remember the little train, and there was a little painted fluorescent skull in the tunnel, and everyone was obliged to scream at that. So I think that was sort of a half-hour break out of rushing from enclosure to enclosure, seeing these amazing animals. And I think when I was finally old enough to go on the elephant ride, I tried to get a back seat so I could reach down and touch it. Other things, the poor old bear pits used to make me sad even as a small child, so I'm glad that they went. Other favourites?
Lions?
Oh, lions, yes. I think one of my earliest sound memories is the sound of the meat slapping down on the cement, because it used to be thrown over the top and we used to watch it go down and the lions would rush at it. And that sort of splat noise is a very distinctive sound in my sort of childhood memory. It wasn't until sort of later in life when you started taking other people around and visiting other zoos that what makes Taronga that incredibly special place is that stunning view. And you come round a corner and you're just simply gobsmacked. And it can be wet weather, it can be dry weather, it can be sunny, it can be stormy, it can be all sorts of things, but it's amazing. The first director, the Lesouffs were actually two brothers, and Albert Lesouff was the first director of Taronga, and his brother, whose first name escapes me, was director of Melbourne Zoo. And Albert had been part of what would have been considered the board of the Moore Park Zoo, the precursor of Taronga. And they knew that they had run out of space and they needed to move. And it was quite a long period where they were deciding where to move, because poor Moore Park suffered from all the sort of biblical plagues and everything else, including bubonic plague breaking out in Sydney. They had floods, they had fires, they had you name it. The locals of Paddington complained that they were open on a Sunday. They had to destroy part of the animal stock because of the plague, for fear the plague would spread through Sydney, through the animals. And they knew that they had to move to build a world-class zoo. And he was a very progressive man, both Lesouffs, which you can see in the design of Melbourne, which is slightly older than current Taronga. But they went on a European study tour, which is what would be called nowadays, and went and visited zoos all around Europe to see what was state-of-the-art in zoos. And the zoo that they really picked as the example was Hagenbeck Zoo in Germany, which based its design on terraces and no bars, so hidden moats and no bars. But they brought the ideas back from that zoo because it was the world-class zoo at that stage. And when they started looking for sites in Sydney, which they did from about 1910 to 1912, they were looking for the potential to have terraces. And obviously that point in Ashton Park was perfect for that. It has its other problems for building, being sort of all sandstone and quite hard to build into, but it was perfect for the terraces. It had natural terraces. But they looked all over the place. They looked down in Sutherland, they looked out at Parramatta, they looked up in the northern beaches, all over Sydney to find a site for the zoo. But the one they finally decided on was the Ashton Park site, simply because the ferry already existed and the ferry wharf down at the point already existed, and the tram line ran down there so that they could get people to this lovely new zoo, because it's the year of the Harbour Bridge, and Taronga opened 20 odd years before the Harbour Bridge was built, so people had to get there by water or by tram or by public transport. So it ended up being a fabulous site. And dear Sir Edward Hallstrom, he was always an honorary director. It wasn't a position at that stage. He did so much to keep the zoo going through the 30s and 40s and 50s. He did put his stamp on it, had a certain look during that period. And it reflected, I guess, the time and the philosophy about zoos, the need for hygiene, the need to keep animals scientifically. It did leave us a legacy of cement and cages for a long time. But fortunately, a lot of those could be modified or changed around. But he ensured that the zoo survived over a period where there was a lot of financial difficulties and things like that. I guess it wasn't till the 60s and 70s where we started to see a growth of a more progressive and naturalistic zoo. The original designs for the zoo were very naturalistic. There was to be no straight lines, there was to be all curving paths and adventure and things like that. It took a little while to get back to, I guess, that philosophy. Both Strawn and we had an American director by the name of Throp. And I think both of them and a few directors during that period really did sort of drag us into the later part of the 20th century at that stage. Elephant Ride, it was both a change in philosophy and a public opinion, but also at that stage the elephants were quite elderly. It takes a lot to train and trust an elephant to do elephant rides, and we had one elephant trained who would respond to one keeper, both of whom were getting on a little bit. So I guess it coincided with a change in public feeling and opinion about elephant rides and the ability of the zoo to provide that service. So it almost meshed in quite nicely to sort of say, oh, look, we'll stop now because we don't have an elephant trained. Because a lot of the elephants we started getting after that period were ex-circus elephants who had caused difficulties. Certainly not an elephant you would train to give rides to kids like they used to. So it wasn't until we got the new ones a few years back that were very young elephants that you could even contemplate allowing them to meet the public, no bars, no nothing. Any contact where the public can get close or touch an animal or interact with an animal always rates very highly on the sort of memory charts of people, visitor appreciation and things like that. Anywhere where they can touch things, meet things, see things happen. I mean, a number of times you see baby goats born or sheep, lambs born down in that Friendship Farm because you just happen to be there at the right time and kids stand there going, oh my God. It was fantastic. It can range from celebrities and Hollywood celebrities or actors and things like that to political figures and all sorts of ones. I suppose one of my favourite ones was Billy Crystal, who is a delightful person, very funny, but quite shy. And took a little while to warm, but he did ask me when he first got out of his car and arrived and shook my hand and whatnot, whether I'd mind he filmed me in his Handycam. And I said, well, just warn me about the close-ups. And after that, we got on like a house on fire. The diplomatic or political, or we often get military delegations that are organised through Department of Foreign Affairs in Canberra as a sort of fill-in for an afternoon on a weekend when they're in Sydney and things like that. So we usually get them for a couple of hours and do some fill-in time and let them take photos of Sydney and get their koala photo and kangaroo photo and things like that. But Air Force One was their morning off and things like that, and they were an absolute hoot. They were very, very funny, particularly when they met one of our emus who was in a sort of fairly frisky mood, who had been hand-raised and thinks humans are emus or vice versa, and he's actually frightened of other emus but loves humans, so when it's mating season he gets very friendly. One of the interesting groups that came through, two of the interesting groups that came through were the firefighters and police survivors from September 11 from New York, and it wasn't long after, it was about a month after, and part of their debriefing, de-traumatising was a visit to Australia, and we had them for a morning. The other group that came out were some of the children from Chernobyl, not long after the Chernobyl disaster. And again, I mean, they didn't speak much English or whatever, but to watch their faces when they saw a koala and things like that, that was pretty special. Interestingly, concerts have been there since year one, since 1916. We used to have a big concert bowl where the Platypus House is now, and the zoo has run concerts virtually through its whole life. They really became big time with the Twilight concerts in the sort of later 80s and whatnot. I suppose with the more recent ones, it's at a time when the zoo itself is closed, so the public coming for the concerts sometimes don't see all that much of the animals. Obviously being nighttime and after hours, a lot of the animals, it's their rest period, so they are locked in night houses or put away and whatnot. So as a zoo experience as such, or an animal encounter experience, the concerts perhaps aren't all that high, but the sounds that people hear, the feeling, the special venue, I think, give people a chance to say, oh God, I haven't been to the zoo for a long time, I'll come back in a few weeks and take the kids, which is what the zoo hopes for, obviously. Even when it's not an official opening time for the zoo, it does, you hear it so often from the visitor, I must come back and see this properly. So that's nice. The zoo itself as a staff is almost a community in itself. You have everything from carpenters to accountants, to zookeepers, to vets, to archivists, to you name it. It's a whole range of skills, and it makes it an interesting place. I mean, some of the keepers' stories are extraordinary, and some of the dedication you see from them. It's a profession, zookeeping, I guess a little bit like nursing. It can take you anywhere in the world because the skills are transferable. So they're lucky in that sense. It's not a highly paid job, and you think, you are amazing people. What you do and the hours you give and the dedication. Zoo, probably before my time, there was a lot of family, your dad was an elephant keeper, so you became an elephant keeper. There's a lot of family follow-on. These days, obviously TAFE runs animal care courses and things like that, so they have to come in with basic qualifications. Some small group of volunteers move across, but not many. It is a highly sought after position these days. There's so many people who want to join the zoo. I think a lot of people, until they become involved with the zoo, don't realise the complexity of the place. Just storage of food and preparing food for animals and things like that. One of our biggest expenditure items is fish, for things like seals, and a lot of the animals eat fish. We have agreements with the fish markets, depending on seasonal varieties we need, and we need a lot of varieties of food. So many of the animals eat things that people don't like to think about, like maggots and fly pupae and rats and mice and crickets and cockroaches and things like that. We breed some of those on site. Obviously it's not practical for us to have a chicken farm or things like that to feed our chickens, so we do buy those commercially. So it's all those behind the scenes things that the volunteers help to educate the public about. Well, if you consider that 98% of Australia's wildlife is nocturnal, there's a lot of animals living in the zoo that aren't part of the collection, like possums, bats, all sorts of things. A lot of the animals, particularly in the summertime, aren't necessarily locked in their night house. They have access to it, but come out. And one of the early stories about the elephants when they arrived was about a month after they arrived, the keepers were a little bit concerned because they came in one morning and the elephants seemed to be terribly lethargic and tired. And we have CCTV to monitor their behaviour and whatnot, so we understand what they're doing and keep an eye on them at night. And so they played back the footage. They had had a pool party most of the night in the moat and had a wonderful time, and they were just exhausted. They'd sort of come inside to have a bit of a snooze now. I mean, no one in their right mind would knock down that main entrance. It's just beautiful. I know it looks like a demented wedding cake or something like that, but it was the style of the time. And it's got all those amazing animal heads on them. The closer you look at it, in all the mouldings, there are squirrels and koalas and all sorts of amazing things. So hopefully that will be more picked out when they finish the renovations of that. It's also iconic. It's amazing how far you can see that dome across Sydney from the ferry, things like that. The elephant temple that you mentioned, it had elephants living in it for 80 years. Now it has been done up on the outside, but we have left the inside as a bit of a museum, and the damage that rubbing and wear and all sorts of things can do to cement by elephants is amazing. So it's fascinating to go in there and see what 80 years of elephant occupation has done. One of the areas that we couldn't keep, but people have very fond memories of, was the Old Aquarium. We have kept the facade and incorporated it into the Great Southern Oceans area, but people remember the grottos with the sharks and the funny old things down there. Unfortunately, it was sort of very early what we term mock rock, which was cement sprayed over chicken wire and wooden superstructures and whatnot, and it finally became too dangerous to keep, both for the keepers and the animals and for the general public. And it made way for a great area, but you sometimes think, oh, you know, people ask fondly about it. That's why we keep the photos and try and acknowledge the historic precincts in the zoo with a bit of history nowadays, which is great. And you need to move forward, but you also need to acknowledge your past as well. Never get rid of the floral clock, I don't think, or hope not. It's a favourite meeting place. If you ask anyone, even these days, and I certainly was when I was a kid, if you get lost and you can't find Mummy and Daddy, go to the floral clock and we'll meet you there. And people, you still hear them say that coming through the gate. So. The refreshment rooms, I remember them as a very small child. They were very fancy in their heyday, in the sort of 40s and whatnot. They served huge meals and they had their own bakery and own kitchen and things like that. They had quite a serious fire, I think in the 1950s. And it was reverted to cafeteria-style food, which is what I kind of remember, but still being quite good. It had a lot of Sir Edward Hallstrom's displays in them. Everything from stuffed rhinoceros to birds of paradise and things like that. I don't remember much about them. They were demolished in the 1970s to make way for the Taronga Centre. And it wasn't really until probably 10 years ago where real work on a new big cafeteria area started. There were lots of little small ones, but feeding the public's always been a bit of a challenge there.